welcome into another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is October 10th, a Thursday around here, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start with the game of the week. We'll break down the Ohio State at Oregon game. Going to be absolutely crazy up there in Eugene. Cannot wait for that game to get underway. Going to be maybe the game of the year. So we'll break it down in the first segment. Then we'll get to Penn State USC. We'll stay in the Big Ten, stay on the West Coast, and we'll break down another big-time game happening in LA this upcoming weekend. Definitely a really interesting one with a lot of people kind of burying USC. Maybe they're not quite as dead as people think. Then we'll get to the Big 12. We'll break down a couple of big-time games there. Arizona at BYU, a huge one for BYU to stay on top of the conference. And then Kansas State at Colorado. Maybe one of the games of the week, but getting a little bit overshadowed by all the other big hitters on this weekend. But then we'll head to a couple of upset alerts going into Week 7. I definitely think there's a couple of teams, including one without their starting quarterback, that definitely could be in a little bit of trouble this upcoming weekend. And then we'll do a little bit of Week 7 whip around, all of the games we haven't had a chance to get to, including a Big 12 one that you probably would have thought we would have broken down on the Big 12 segment, but I'll break down exactly why I didn't in that segment. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use the Super Chat feature. Click on that $ on the Sports Network page, add any question, comment you'd like, and your name will pop up, your question will pop up on the screen. We can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible, and especially with a huge weekend, want to hear what you guys have to say, obviously. But let's jump into this, because this might be the game of the year. It's absolutely incredible what we're going to be able to see in Eugene, Oregon this upcoming weekend, and there's so many different things that go into this. Obviously, two of the best teams in the country, playing in one of the best venues in the country, two teams that very much are looking at a national title as a very real possibility, and they very much should. These rosters are absolutely ridiculous from top to bottom. They are as deep, as versatile, as talented as any rosters in the entire country. So what's going to happen in this one? Obviously, this is a big-time step up for Ohio State. No two ways about that. They have not necessarily played an elite opponent. I would argue Oregon's gotten a little bit bigger of a test against Boise State, but at the end of the day, this is a big-time step up for Oregon all the same. So it's going to be interesting to see how these two teams react. We're going to pretty much learn what these two teams are on Saturday. So it's going to be really, really fun to watch this. For Oregon, I think this is a huge spot for the program. This is a moment where Dan Lanning can kind of shake off the cobwebs, all of the stuff that happened last year where a couple of big-time games just missed the mark a little bit. This would be where all of that kind of washes away. And I think he's done an incredible job building that program, and I fully expect them to be big-time players for years to come. But this is kind of the moment when everything kind of flips for you. You go into a new conference, you beat the big dogs on campus or on the block, and you keep rolling, and possibly to a Big Ten title. And then you got two of the highest profile transfer quarterbacks this offseason in this game, and it's exactly why you brought him in, right? Will Howard coming in because, you fit the Chip Kelly offense a little bit more prolific of a passer than what Devin Brown is, than what Julian Sayin is at this very moment. And he's played really well thus far. It's going to be a huge step up in competition, particularly on the defensive line, than he has faced pretty much this entire year. And frankly, I think this is the toughest environment he's played in his entire career. So it's going to be interesting to see how he handles that. Dillon Gabriel has the home crowd, but he's also staring down about 15 NFL players on that defense for Ohio State. So how he handles that will be very, very interesting to watch. But the reality is, this is why you go get these two guys. This is why you go snatch them up from the portal, and you hope that they can lead you to a victory. And I think two of the biggest things to watch here is there's a couple of huge matchups, and frankly, there's huge matchups all over the field. But I think the Ohio State O-line against the Oregon D-line is a very interesting one. I would say pretty decidedly the advantages with Oregon there, and you'll have to see what Ohio State can do in the run game. Obviously, they're plenty dynamic in that facet, so maybe the O-line is able to hold their own just enough to give Quinshon Judkins, to give Travion Henderson the lanes that they need. But the reality is, it's going to be incredible to watch that matchup. Maybe that's where Oregon tips the scales in their favor. And then you got the Oregon wide receivers against this Ohio State back end. And frankly, you could pick either one of those if you really wanted to. I think I might lean Ohio State secondary, but it's very, very, very close. Two very elite talents on that team, and frankly, it's going to be incredible to watch what they can do against this back end. Both teams are very much looking at the national title, and this is kind of the point where everything kind of flips for them. Ohio State still has some very tough ones coming up. Same thing with Oregon, and if you get this one, you are probably the number one team in the country. depending on what Texas does, obviously, but at least in my opinion, you probably be the number one team in the country, and you definitely would be the favorite in the Big Ten going forward. So this is a moment, no two ways about that, and we'll see who can react to it the best. But a couple of players to watch. Jordan James has to be really good in this game. He has to be probably played one of the best football games he's played in his entire career at Oregon, because the reality is they're not beating Ohio State just through the air. That's just not something that they're going to be able to do, and frankly, there's no one that's going to be able to do that this year. So you're going to have to get the run game going, a very good defensive line for Ohio State, a really solid offensive line for Oregon, still dealing with a couple of injuries here lingering, but the reality is a very good unit that has gotten a little bit more healthy and is kind of imposing their will at this very moment. So need Jordan James, need to be able to run the ball, and if you can't, then I think it might be a long day for this Oregon offense. Then we got Jordan Burch, and this is more about the run game for Ohio State. I think early on in the year, we didn't necessarily see a ton from Will Howard when it came to running the football. It was a little bit more just kind of get in, get the win, get out type of mentality for Ohio State, and I fully understand that. I think they're going to open it up a little bit more, and I think a lot of it's going to have to do with that quarterback run game. That means Jordan Burch, Mateo Uiagalelei, all of these edge rushers for Oregon are huge in this game. They have to get upfield. They have to try to take away Will Howard's legs, and if they can't, this Ohio State offense is going to be able to run the ball, and that is the absolute death sentence for Oregon. So we'll figure out what Jordan Burch and these edge rushers in general can do for this game. Carnell Tate's another guy to watch in this one because Ohio State, through the first couple of weeks of the season, as we talked about, has been keeping it a little bit bland on offense, and with that has come Emeka Egbuka and Jeremiah Smith being a huge part of their offense, which obviously they're as good as it possibly gets. So it's not necessarily that it's a bad thing. I do think you're going to have to open it up a little bit more. I think Oregon has enough guys on that back end, not necessarily the elite group that Ohio State has, but plenty of guys on that back end that can make really good plays. You're going to have to spread the ball out just a little bit more. So Carnell Tate, Brennan Ennis, all of the tight ends that haven't really gotten involved, definitely get them the ball and just kind of make this Oregon defense spread out as much as possible. And then this is the game wrecker. This is Jack Sawyer, the guy that can totally take over this game not if he wants to, because of course he wants to, but the reality is two very good tackles with Johnny Cornelius as well as Josh Connerly over at Oregon, and he's going to have his hands full. You have really good edge rushers for Ohio State, and Jack Sawyer is one of those guys that he's been there for a while. He badly wants to get this win. He badly wants to win a national title this year, and I think he might just come with a lot of energy in this one. So cannot wait to see what this guy can do. And frankly, he could be the guy that we talk about the most at the end of this game because he might just wreck it all together. How Ohio State can win this game, you got to find running lanes. We talked about it earlier. Ohio State's O-line is their weakness. Now, not necessarily a bad unit, which gives you an idea of how good Ohio State is, but the reality is you're going to have to find openings for Travion Henderson, for Crenshaw Judkins, for Will Howard. You're going to have to get that a part of the game because Will Howard's not this prolific passer that's going to fit it into really tight windows. You have to pull the linebackers, you have to pull the safeties down into the box, and then throw over top of them and give Will Howard openings to throw. So the reality is, if you can't run the ball if you're Ohio State, you don't have much of an offense. Playing against a very good defense against Oregon. So you're going to have to get this run game going early. You're going to have to make sure that you find lanes. I tend to believe they will just because of how dynamic that run game is and how hard it is for any defensive line really to get a beat on what they're doing. But it's going to be a fight, definitely, no doubt about that. Then on the other side, you got to keep the Oregon run game under wraps. Jordan James, Noah Whittington are massive in this game for Oregon because I don't know if I trust Dillon Gabriel to just stand back there and make the throws that he needs to make without a run game. So if you're Ohio State, stop him for very little yards after contact, very little explosives in the run game, and you're probably in a pretty good position because the reality is if you're able to handle this run game with 4 or 5 guys in the box, then you have a ton of guys on that back end, and frankly, you might be able to do it with the front 7 and then just leave the other guys on the back end to really do what they do, which is lock up receivers. So the reality is Ohio State has the dudes to do this. There's no two ways about that. Now, Oregon has the offensive line to kind of push them around and possibly kind of impose their will in that front. So you'll have to figure out what they can do, but I think that if they can slow down this run game, it's going to be really hard for Oregon to get much of anything going offensively. And then you got to collapse the pocket. I really like Dillon Gabriel. I think he's a very good player. That being said, if you move him off his spot, if you make sure that he is not necessarily sitting there making all the throws that he needs to make, and obviously if he gets moved off his spot, he can make plays. He's not necessarily totally useless once he gets out of the pocket. He can make plays with his legs, and Ohio State's going to have to worry about that on Saturday. It was probably the reason that Oklahoma won against Texas last year was because Dillon Gabriel extended plays with his legs. So there's a lot of different things to take into account here, but the reality is collapse the pocket, make him think a little bit more, and then he'll probably make one or two throws that you can take advantage of and take the other way. So going to be a huge game, but the reality is get to Dillon Gabriel, you probably win this one if you're Ohio State. On the Oregon side, you have an ability to win the trenches in this game. The Ohio State defensive line is absolutely elite in every way. Your offensive line's really solid, and I don't know if they're going to outright dominate them, but control that battle. Stay on even footing in that battle, and then your defensive line should be able to beat up this offensive line for Ohio State. Now, that's going to be a battle, no two ways about that. The Ohio State offensive line is not terrible by any means, but if there's a decided advantage in this game, it's probably the Oregon D-line against the Ohio State O-line, if I had to imagine at least. And so if Oregon can control the line of scrimmage, limit Ohio State's run game at least a little bit with all of the different weapons they have, and get theirs going downhill, they have every ability to kind of roll in this game. I don't want to say roll. They have every ability to control the pace of this game and win it at home. So it's going to be really incredible to watch that. And frankly, if you just look at the bodies right now, I tend to lean Oregon, at least in the trenches in particular. Then you got to get Will Howard's mistake early. If I had to imagine, this crowd is going to be on fire to start this game, and the worst thing that could possibly happen is Ohio State slowly rolls down the field on a 12-play drive and scores a touchdown. You have to avoid that at all costs. And frankly, Will Howard has made a mistake in every 3 of the games in the past 3 weeks. He's thrown a pick that has not been great in most of those weeks. If you can get that mistake early, if you can go up by 7-0, 14-0 with a mistake from Will Howard, this crowd's going to be into it, and it's going to be really hard for him to find his footing, especially in an environment that's going to be just on fire. Then you got to let your playmakers work. This back end is not going to give you breathing room. It's going to be impossible to throw into the teeth of this back end and expect consistent success. Now, you're going to have to do it at some point. That's the reality of this game. Dillon Gabriel is going to have to make throws at some point, elite throws that he was brought in to make. But the reality is, as good as the Ohio State back end is, you get the ball to Ted Johnson, Evan Stewart, Jerry and Dickey, all of these elite wide receivers on the outside, and just let them go, they will make big plays. Now, they might be a little bit fewer and further between than you'd like, but the reality is you might not need too many. I think there's going to be a little bit of a rock fight, and frankly, I went back and forth every which way from Tuesday on this one. I have probably 10 different picks on this game before I finally came to mine, and frankly, it's kind of just going with my gut and picking that team by 1 point. I'm going to go with Ohio State in this game, and frankly, it's one of those things that I just think at some point, Dillon Gabriel is going to have to make the throws, and I think Will Howard might not have to. I don't think Will Howard's going to be asked to do nearly as much in this game as Dillon Gabriel, and when I look back and see Dillon Gabriel is going to have to make the throws into tight windows at some point in this game, I'm having a hard time seeing that not end in at least a couple of picks and Ohio State making big plays down the stretch. So I am going to go Ohio State, and I'm going to go them by the slimmest of margins you could possibly imagine. Frankly, I think we're going to walk out of this game saying that's 2 of the best teams in the country, and there's no doubt about that. So it's going to be an incredible game. No two ways about that. I just kind of went with my gut at the end of the day, if I'm being totally honest, but I do think Ohio State gets the win. I think they keep rolling on and get a huge statement win for this title run that they're trying to be on. So it's going to be incredible to watch that one unfold, but let's take our first break here. And when we come back, we're going to get into Penn State at USC, a huge, huge game out there in LA, and I cannot wait for it, but we'll break it down right after this.